Well, I do hope that you'll be able to take me seriously after that wolf bit. I never can tell if that wolf is from Chicago or Hoboken, New Jersey. But it seems to be the appropriate voice. So shortly before the presidential election of 2016, HBO comedian John Oliver, love Bill Maher, but I like John Oliver too, revealed that Donald Trump's family name had once been Drumpf, but was changed somewhere along the line by an ancestor. It's the sound produced when a morbidly obese pigeon flies into the window of a foreclosed Old Navy. Drumpf, Oliver joked. And he had a lot of fun with this phonetically funny sounding name, and given its kinship with a similar sounding word, it's a good one to help express how many of us are feeling these days. Drumpffounded. It seems since Trump took office, we've been pummeled almost daily with unbelievable, frightening, disheartening, Drumpffounding news. Like his appointment of a white supremacist to head the Justice Department. Banning transgender troops. Firing the FBI director investigating him. Withdrawing the U.S. from the Paris Climate Treaty, dropping the biggest bomb since Hiroshima on Afghanistan, threatening nuclear war with North Korea, imposing travel bans on Muslims and other political refugees, ending DACA, taking health care away from millions, giving billions in tax breaks to the wealthiest Americans, praising and inviting murderers, dictators, to the White House while betraying our nation's allies in an endless barrage of childish tweets. And I won't mention what has happened to our Supreme Court. And the list goes on and on. If you're like me, you feel Drumpffounded most of the time. So don't let my play on words mislead you into thinking that I'm not serious about how, as religious liberals, Unitarian Universalists can take heart and move forward when faced with today's depressing and discouraging political and social realities. But I'm also happy to start with a little political satire, given that humor is one of the best ways of reducing anxiety and making our problems feel manageable. I know in this age of political correctness, many frown upon laughing at the expense of others and upon not taking serious matters seriously, but the very root of the word human is the same as in the root of the word humor. It is also the root of the word humus, meaning earth. Humans are humorous. Life on earth is humorous. And to be human, to be of the earth, requires us to have a good sense of humor. Because we couldn't survive all of its hardships and its sufferings if we couldn't laugh now and again. So I'm being serious when I say that humor is one of the valuable tools in our toolbox for coping with our Drumpffoundedness. This is why political satirists like John Oliver and Bill Maher and Trevor Noah and Samantha Bee and Michael Moore and Stephen Colbert and, of course, the great Jon Stewart, God rest his soul, are so successful because through laughter they help us make some of our greatest concerns seem just a little less overwhelming. In fact, the very word satire comes from the Greek satyrs, which refers to mythological figures who were always publicly lewd and indecent. In other words, the satyr is the original dirty joke. And the satyrs were those who brought up topics considered inappropriate or politically correct in polite company. Statues of some of those lewd satyrs were actually used in Greek gardens as scarecrows, which is the entire point of humor, according to psychotherapist Thomas More, to scare away, in his words, all kinds of winged spirits, our lofty thoughts, our airy ideas, our flighty opinions, our otherworldly aspirations. This is why inappropriate jokes often emerge in the wake of great tragedies, because they help make our loads feel lighter by making light of the things weighing most heavily upon us. So keep watching The Daily Show in real time with Bill Maher and Full Frontal with Samantha Bee, last week with John Oliver, or whichever political satirists tickle your fancy. Or check out the political cartoons in the paper, or just take a break and go to a comedy club or watch one of your favorite comedies on TV. In theatrical tradition, comedy and tragedy are always linked together, just as we saw in that, or heard in the special music today, right? They're always linked together because we can't really go through one without going through the other. So find ways to laugh, to pressurize, lighten the load with a little humor in these Drumpffounding days. It's equally as important, probably more so, to remain alert and resolute. If the election of Donald Trump was a wake-up call, then some of us must have been asleep at the wheel. In 2008, for instance, immediately following the historic election of President Obama, the GOP devised a plan, Project Red Map, to elect key officials around the country in time for the 2010 census, when the U.S. Constitution allows states to redistrict their voting precincts. Within just a couple of years, the GOP was able to quadruple its power to redistrict states, took over both houses, and effectively blocked Obama from accomplishing much of anything else for another 6 years. Project Red Map, which stands for Redistricting Majority Project, happened openly, right under our noses, and nobody made a move to stop it. This, in addition to voter suppression laws, mass voter purging, and a criminal justice system that disproportionately disenfranchises non-whites, likely Democratic voters, were all accomplished with little notice or pushback, skewing election results in favor of a minority of voters. So democracy wasn't stolen. It was ignored, maybe even given away. Maybe some felt, having successfully elected a Democrat to the presidency and our nation's first African-American president, that we could take a break. We now know, unfortunately, that white supremacy remains alive and well and vocal in our country. But why did it take a racist president who has appointed numerous white nationalists to his cabinet, or Nazis marching in our streets chanting, "Jews will not replace us," whom Trump has called some very fine people, for us to realize this? The reality is, little has changed in our country since the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, or the Fair Housing Act of 1968. According to sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva, to this day, blacks and most racial minorities lag behind whites in terms of income, wealth, occupational and health status, educational attainment, and other relative social indicators. To better grasp the bottom line of what this means, according to an article recently appearing in The State, the latest figures from the U.S. Census Bureau show that the median net worth for an African-American family is now $9,000 and $12,000 for a Latino family, compared to $132,000 for a white family. The investigative report entitled "Kept Out: How Banks Block People of Color from Home Ownership" begins by acknowledging 50 years after the Federal Fair Housing Act banned racial discrimination in lending, African Americans and Latinos continue to be routinely denied conventional mortgage loans at rates far higher than their white counterparts. Yet so far, Trump's Justice Department hasn't filed suit against a single lending institution for violating the Community Reinvestment Act, which for more than 40 years has legally required them to solicit clients, borrowers, and depositors from all segments of their communities. So the real concern should be why many of us are only now, in the aftermath of Trump's election, waking up to the reality of white supremacy in our nation, when again so little has changed. So little has changed in the 1960s. In fact, much has gotten worse. Despite these ongoing inequities, during his entire 8 years in office, Obama's Justice Department sued only 9 lending institutions for violating fair housing laws. Here's another example. Last November in the New York Times, in an article entitled "The Coast Guard's Floating Guantanamos," about how the U.S. is using ships floating in international waters to detain prisoners for long periods of time without due process of law. After the report, Democracy Now! Noted that the extraterritorial confinement program was escalated under the watch of General John Kelly, whom Amy Goodman was quick to point out, is Trump's White House Chief of Staff. What she didn't mention, however, is that Kelly started this between 2012 and 2016, during Obama's administration. We should also keep in mind that the U.S. Supreme Court didn't recognize the right of same-sex marriage until 2015, near the end of Obama's term in office, and that when he was running, he expressed opposition to marriage equality. Also, it was only after much pressure from environmental activists that he finally decided to reject the Keystone Pipeline, and that was a fight. And he was mostly quiet about the Dakota Access Pipeline until within just 48 days left in office, he put a temporary hold on the project, effectively passing the buck for the next president. And we all know how that has worked out. And this isn't about criticizing Obama. My point, rather, is those of us advocating for marriage equality or other issues like income equality and protecting our environment have had to struggle just as hard with Democrats in office as we now do under Trump. So when I'm asked what we do now or what we can do, I say we keep doing what we've been doing for decades. Working to make our world more just and more peaceful for everyone. As Drumpffounded as we may feel, the issues before us today are the issues that were before us yesterday, and last year, and many years and decades before. So in addition to keeping a sense of humor, it may help to keep in mind that things have not exactly been easy for us liberals for a long time. We must keep our eyes on the prize, ending income inequality, dismantling ancient systems of white supremacy, ridding our world of nuclear weapons, protecting the environment, and reversing global warming, getting weapons of war off our streets and out of the hands of people who want to kill our children, gender equality, and protecting women from sexual harassment and abuse, and so many other issues that we have been dealing with for years. Not just the past couple of years. And this means, most importantly, in addition to keeping a sense of humor and remembering things have never exactly been easy for us, that we must still do something. We can't be left so Drumpffounded that we are too depressed or despondent to keep up the good fight. We must remain engaged in the enduring work of justice making. And as Unitarian Universalists, we must do so together. The question then is, how do we best practice what we preach today? What can we do as Unitarian Universalists to make a difference now? As part of a religious organization, there are certain rules of engagement that we do need to consider, even though being a nonprofit 501c3 doesn't mean, as many think, that we're not supposed to engage in politics at all. For example, when I gave a version of this sermon in St. George, Utah earlier this year, a fellow showed up that nobody knew, didn't speak to anyone, had very hostile body language, never looked up, and took notes the whole time I spoke. I presume that he presumed that I couldn't talk about politics in church and was there to catch me in the act so that he could report me to the Gestapo. If he'd have just asked, I would have given him a copy of my entire transcript, in which I explain that to maintain our tax-exempt status, churches and other 501c3s are not allowed to officially endorse or campaign on behalf or against political candidates. And that's pretty much the only limitation that we have. A religious organization can hold candidate forums to educate the community about the positions that certain politicians hold, engage in get-out-the-vote drives, and spend a non-substantial amount of its budget on lobbying efforts, up to $1 million, if your budget is large enough. Don't we all wish? So long as it does all of these things in a nonpartisan fashion. We're also perfectly free to publicly advocate for the issues that we support, including initiatives and referendums, just as we did in Spokane when our church paid for marriage equality billboards in 2012, directly stating, "Vote yes on Referendum 74, sponsored by the Unitarian Universalist Church." So outside of telling people who they should vote for, don't let anyone tell you that as Unitarian Universalists we can't engage in politics. The question is, should we? Is it ethical for us to do so? According to the latest Pew Research, a growing number of people considering themselves spiritual but not religious are turned off by organized religion because they say churches are too involved in politics. Most of these, however, still identify as Christians, but simply don't go to church anywhere. So in other words, what they mean by spiritual but not religious habitually is expressed as Christians but not church-going. While I certainly understand why so many are turned off by the commingling of religion and politics these days, I personally don't know how to be religious without being political. I'm not turned off by religion and politics. I'm turned off by religions engaged in the wrong politics. The politics of inequality, the politics of discrimination, and the politics of exploitation. Using religion as an excuse to justify mistreating and oppressing others ought to trouble us all. But using religion as a political force to liberate the oppressed and make our world a more just and peaceful place for all beings is, to me, the very point of religion. For what is the point of religion if it's not making justice, creating heaven on earth, and being the change that we wish to see? This is why the words politics and liturgy share the same root. Politics means the will of the people, and liturgy means the work of the people. One must follow the other. It isn't enough to merely want transformation. We must work for it. Faith without works is dead. Faith without action is pointless. And faith that's used to justify injustice isn't faith at all. Karen Armstrong, the renowned authority on world religion, says that all the major religions that are on earth today began in response to injustice. What mattered in the beginning, she says, was not what you believed, but how you behaved. This is why the Hebrew book of Amos says, I hate and reject your festivals, and your religious ceremonies stink. This is my own translation. I cannot accept your burnt offerings and refuse to look at your animal sacrifices. I can't stand that noise you call singing and music. Instead of all that, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. That's religion. It's why Isaiah says that the entire purpose of religion is to bring relief to the poor, to heal the downtrodden, to proclaim liberty to the oppressed, and to set the captives free. And that means bringing an end to prison. That's another sermon. But we got to get rid of that meme. We don't need prison. Be like the indigenous peoples who use restorative justice and have no word in their languages for prison. We need to eradicate it from our language again, too. But that's another sermon. As some Christian scholars now recognize, even Jesus' parables are not merely earthly stories with heavenly meanings. Rather, as William Herzog says in his books, Parables as Subversive Speech, Jesus' ministry was concerned with political and economic issues. Matters of justice were not peripheral to his spiritual gospel, but were at the heart of his proclamation and practice. Or as theologian Walter Wink more succinctly says, almost every sentence Jesus uttered was an indictment against the domination system or a disclosure of an alternative to it. Indeed, some of the most admired social reformers in modern history have been religious leaders engaged in politics. Mahatma Gandhi was a devout Hindu and spiritual leader of an ashram. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister. Susan B. Anthony, an abolitionist and leader in the women's suffrage movement, was inspired by her Quaker religion. Daniel and Philip Berrigan, who were on the FBI's most wanted list for burning Vietnam draft notices with napalm, were both Catholic priests, as was Archbishop Oscar Romero, assassinated in 1980 for speaking against government oppression and death squads in San Salvador. The world-renowned peace activist Thich Nhat Hanh is a Buddhist priest, and the Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of Tibet, is one of today's greatest human rights activists. So as Unitarian Universalists, I say that we can and we should remain politically active in our communities and in our world. As a UU minister, I've been politically engaged for years. And though the men in black have come around a couple of times, so far they've not threatened the 501c3 status of the two churches I've pastored during the past 20 years. Not that losing our tax-exempt status should be our primary concern to begin with. There are more important things in life than avoiding taxes. After the 2004 national election in Kentucky, where I was living at the time, which was among the first of 11 states to pass constitutional amendments officially banning same-sex marriage, the following Sunday, I told my congregation that I could no longer in good conscience perform weddings for anyone until I am free to perform them for everyone, including, of course, gay and lesbian couples. Although the good folks at the Clifton Unitarian Church in Louisville applauded and supported my decision, my secular employers reprimanded and demoted me, then asked for my resignation, and a few weeks later they fired me. Even so, I didn't perform a wedding ceremony for almost a decade, until 2012 when it became legal for me to do so in Washington. Since January of 2017, furthermore, I've addressed politics in more than half of my sermons, including today's. In 2017, I also filed an initiative in Spokane that, if passed, would have fined oil and coal companies for unsafely transporting fossil fuels through Spokane. Unfortunately, the railroad outspent our grassroots campaign an estimated $500,000 to our $6,000, and we lost by 9 percentage points. A few weeks later, however, Washington's Governor, Jay Inslee, rejected the last of 6 permit requests to construct a fossil fuel export facility on Washington's coastline, partly out of concern for the safety of Spokane, he said, reciting the very talking points expressed in our initiative word for word. Even though we lost locally, our work ended up being the cover our governor needed to give us a statewide victory by saying no to the deadly and dying fossil fuel industry. I also often hold fundraisers for political candidates in my home. And I've engaged in all these activities and more, not because I'm overly political, but again, because I am deeply religious. Because I am a Unitarian Universalist. And I don't know how to be religious without also being political. Liturgics without politics is dead. Like many of you, I'm guessing, I feel Drumpffounded most of the time nowadays, but I counter my confusion and despondency by keeping my sense of humor, remembering things have never been easy for religious liberals, and by remaining active in the work of social and environmental justice. The long arc of the universe may bend towards justice, but I am quite sure that it won't get there without us. That even if some of us never make it there ourselves, no one will ever reach the promised land without our help. Thank you.